Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Fireside Chat with Rich and Matt, Africa's Birds, Part 3, presented by NatHab Expedition Leaders, Richard de Gouveia and Matt Meyer. It's a pleasure as always, gentlemen. Rich, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thanks, Kendall, and welcome, guys. We're so happy to be back and on the thunderstorms. Matt's at his home, I'm at mine, so hopefully we'll have smooth sailing with the internet, but that being said, it'll probably crash in the next 2 minutes. We're really excited to be chatting today, and first order of business is I would like to formally congratulate Matt on becoming a baby daddy. He has a little baby girl named Violet, and he will be presenting from her bedroom because she's taken up space in his. So over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks, Kendall. And yeah, thanks as always to my co-host and partner in crime. Let's fingers crossed that our connection can hold us through tonight. And I think maybe it's just we're far enough apart now that nothing's going to collapse. But yes, I thought it fitting to present from in here tonight, and what an amazing week it was. But let's actually, while we're on that topic and looking at where we are, Rich, do you want to show everyone back home just how behind the scenes things look? We might look good and professional and sort of glamorous in front of the camera here, but this is how things are. You can actually see the stool that my computer is on is being propped up by earbuds. And so, yeah.
And I have a mattress in the background to ensure that there is no echo in the room. And as you can see, my pretty setup looks pretty crazy when you get the camera the other way.
Oh, shucks. The joys of being a dad. The joys of being a dad. Anyway, so tonight, what we decided to do in our third and final installment of African Birds was kind of focus in on a few individual species that have incredible adaptations that have allowed them to evolve and become successful in the niches that they hold in their environments. And to start that off, we couldn't pick a better example of an incredible journey by a bird that is known around the world. The barn swallow, as it is called, is one of the few birds that occurs on all of the continents. It is a little bird that, if you take, for example, the barn swallow that comes into South Africa, they undergo a monumental 6,000-mile journey going from their breeding grounds in the UK to the feeding grounds in South Africa and vice versa. So they do that journey twice a year, and that's following the food. So their food are little micro insects all the way up to larger insects. And that food obviously dies down in the winter months in the northern hemisphere. Then they come down to the southern hemisphere and they feed. They breed in the north and they feed in the south. Now, these guys will cover, like I said, 2,000 or 6,000 miles, and that will be covered in increments of about 200 miles a day. So you're looking at about a 30-day journey for this tiny little bird about this big to go across the world. Now, they're going from the UK, they fly across over the Mediterranean Sea, which is all well and good. Then their first obstacle is flying over the Sahara Desert, which at the best of times is completely barren of any insects whatsoever. So these guys will gorge themselves in the northern hemisphere. They'll breed up, and then once they are ready to go, on their muscles and on their muscular attachments, they've got tiny little polyps of fat. They're yellow fat cells, so not white fat that's quick burning and everything. They've got these little yellow fat cells that allow them to do to traverse this incredible journey. And they will still feed on the wing as well as they're going. So they'll cover this distance in 60 days, then they'll spend their summer months in the southern hemisphere. And just as our insects start to go dormant going into the fall and the autumn months, they then continue to fly back. Now, these males they're pretty violent little guys. You can see here is an adult feeding its brood in the nest that it's created there. But to ensure their competition and their genes are passed through, males will intentionally break down another male's nest because they're monogamous. So a pair will pair for life. Now, there's only one way that this will, or two ways, sorry, that this will then be cut short, is if the female or the male dies, or if they undergo birdie divorce. And how that happens is another male will break down another brood's nest, thereby killing all of those, making the female think that her male has created an inferior nest, thereby making her need to find another male. Now, obviously, she's not going to know exactly which male broke that nest down, so she will just go around. So it's kind of a hit and a miss from this male that's going out and intentionally wrecking a home to get another mate, because he might not actually get a mate. So this little adaptation has caused them to have a fairly high infant mortality, and so by sheer the rest of their adaptations that are so incredible has allowed them to be carried on through as a species and evolve, and to encounter and make this insurmountable journey twice a year for a bird that's that big.
That is madness. That gives a whole new meaning to homewrecker.
I know.
And I mean, just that is a mad thing. And those yellow fat cells are just too cool. Now we're going to move from a little bird that's like this big onto one that is the size of Danny DeVito. It stands at 1.5 meters tall, and it is called a shoebill. As you can see by these images, the bill resembles that of a shoe. And these crazy creatures look like dinosaurs, can live for up to 35 years. So massive, long lifespan. And the beak is about 10 inches long and about 8 inches wide. So it's a massive piece. And they use this bill to catch their main prey, which are eels, catfish, which we call barbel, snakes, and lungfish. And these guys will literally sit in ambush of these creatures within these very long grasses. So as much as this is nice and out in the open, there is a major hidden side of them. So to see them is a really big deal. Now, when we go to Uganda, we go to one area called the Shasha, and there is a swampy section where these guys live, but it is so inaccessible and so difficult that we really don't get a chance to do it. But if you are going, the day before, there's always a trip to an island where these birds can be seen, and it's really worth going to do. So their numbers are very low because of habitat loss, because of interaction with people. They're less than 10,000 birds, and they are very solitary. Even mating pairs, while mating, will do their business and then feed separately. There is no interaction besides that initial bit. And the mating is quite interesting, or the brooding is quite interesting, because once the eggs have hatched and the young ones come out, they can often have 2 eggs. And what happens is intense competition between these two. And just a day or two difference between the first and the second eggs hatching will change the course of the second baby's life, because the older one will try and out compete it. So you can see that, like, it will go to mom and start saying, listen, mom, I need some water. And as soon as mom goes off to go get water, it'll start picking at the other one and trying to chase it away, forcing it to be independent. Now, this can go on for 2 months to up to a year. Sometimes they can kill their sibling. Sometimes that happens just throughout competing it, and the mother actually just chooses the stronger one. There's always this very delicate balance in nature that you have to find. And with bigger birds and the fact that these things live so long, you can't have hundreds of thousands of them in our current climate going around. So nature has to find that balance. Now, when they're born, because of the size of this bill, they have very big problems with trying to walk, trying to even stand up. This bill weighs so much, so they use their wings. And even at this age where they're big, they have to use their wings while they're moving to be able to keep balance. So incredibly cool birds and prehistoric ones. And now it's time to move on to something of a little bit more color, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, that bill is essentially the size of a loaf of bread with a giant hook on it to catch those catfish. So, I mean, you can imagine that's quite a formidable weapon when going against having a bit of sibling rivalry. So, flamingos. So, across the world, there are 6 or 7 species of flamingos. In Africa, we've got 2. We've got the lesser and the greater flamingo. They are obviously known for their pink color, which they get from their food. The lesser flamingo eats what's it called, blue-green algae. Sorry, and they filter that through lamella in their bill. So their bill sits like that, and they filter feed. And then the larger, greater flamingo eats crustaceans, small invertebrates, etc. And they also filter through the same way. But the main difference between the two is that you can see there the bottom right picture, the one that has its head on top of the water. That's a lesser flamingo. Now, they are water filter feeders. So they will walk through the water kind of like this, and they will filter it through using their tongue to swish through the substrate in the water and then filter out all of the food and the nutrients that they're getting. But the greater flamingo is a bottom feeder, essentially. So they completely submerge their head under the water and ruffle it around in mud. And so as they're walking, kind of like a hammerkorp does, as they're walking, their feet are moving like this, ruffling up any of the mud, anything that's living in that mud bottom, and then they are more chomping it up, but still filtering through with that bill, kind of like a whale. So the big thing that's standing in these guys' ways is they essentially live and feed and breed in very shallow but very large bodies of water, and that allows their nutrients to be. This is the lesser flamingo. This is Lake Nakuru in Kenya, and this water is probably only about maybe a foot and a half deep. Some very famous footage going around. You see these guys taking off from there, and they're being chased by hyenas, fish eagles as well. And so with that sort of shallow and a very large body of water, the evapotranspiration that occurs there allows that top sediment of nutrients to be very concentrated. That blue-green algae and the sort of microplankton that they're eating is extremely concentrated in that. But as global warming is increasing, that water is starting to evaporate at a lot faster of a rate. And by doing so, that is increasing the salt levels. So you're getting a much higher level of saline coming through in their diet, which is then obviously affecting the shell hardness and their breeding time of year. There is one of the biggest breeding sites for both the lesser and the greater flamingo is in Botswana in the Lechari salt pans. And the big thing with that is that their water, and you can see this is a research project ongoing there, the water quality is getting lesser and lesser. And there is more mud in that area. And as I described earlier, the greater flamingo is the more mud feeding, whereas the lesser is the shallow water. And through increase in overgrazing and soil erosion in the outlying areas, all of the rivers that flow into this massive salt pan, where they will feed and breed for half of the year, is now starting to soil that pan. And so through the help of one of these, this is a project that was started in 1998, through projects like this, where local communities are brought in and incentivized to do this conservation work, to get interested, to go to university, to study it, seeing the future value in this pan, not so much as a place for their cattle to come and graze, but a place for flamingos to come and breed. Now, it's a small, single, isolated project, but the ripple-on effects and seeing the success of this project in Botswana could then help with breeding sites up in East Africa. They come so far as down into northern South Africa, so in the Northern Cape, so south and west of where I am, where Rich is at the moment. They're these massive pans that now form in what we know as the Green Kalahari, so the very southern part of the Kalahari Desert. Every 10 or 15 years or so, they get this massive influx of rain, their 10-year flood, and the flamingos come down and they'll feed in those pans. They won't breed in them because they're not permanent pans, but in doing so, we'll bring them further down, allow them to find and establish a new area, and then they can move up. But their breeding biology is so intricate and so dependent on these massive flat, or not flat, but massive big pans, that climate change is negatively affecting them. So for a sort of a plankton feeder in fresh water, these kinds of projects are incredibly necessary for their future survival.
So it's an amazing thing, and there's some cool footage that has gone viral with them all doing their little dances during mating, moving up and down through these pans in little groups, and they shuffle, 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 and shuffle, shuffle all the way along, which is very cool. And one of the birds that I'm going to talk about later takes advantage of these guys' long treks that they have to do. But before we do that, we're going to go into another very specialized bird that occurs along the South African coast, which is called an African black oyster catcher. Now, oyster catchers in Southern Africa, there are two types. The African black oyster catcher, which is an endemic bird, and for those of you who don't understand the word endemic, means that it is only found in Southern Africa. It is only found in this region. It doesn't go anywhere else. And the Eurasian oyster catcher is a vagrant which flies in from time to time. Now, as the name suggests, it is a very highly specialized feeder that feeds on crustaceans, on these mussels, oysters, and other shelled marine animals. Now, to extricate these animals from their shells, their bill has become very specially adapted. What they have done is they've got a long, sturdy bill that it's like a chisel, and it's laterally compressed to be able to force its way through the little crack in the shells, and to then be able to open that up and force it open to get to the mussels inside. Now, in this bird, there's a crazy thing where they have reverse sexual dimorphism, which basically means the female is bigger than the male. And if you look at her bill versus his, they're two different sizes. Now, again, nature is setting itself up for success. If they're all feeding on the same size mollusks or shelled creatures, they're going to run out of food at some stage. So the one has a bigger bill than the other. So the female feeds on bigger mussels or on bigger oysters than the male, so that there is less interspecies competition between them, which is really cool. So then the major differences between the African black flycat, oyster catcher, and the Eurasian oyster catcher, again, to not overpopulate an area or overutilize an area, is the black oyster catchers feed off of crustaceans that are on rocks, and the Eurasian feed on sandy slopes where they actually dig into the sand and find the crustaceans within it. Now, their feeding is very tidal dependent. At high tide, none of these crustaceans are going to be above surface. So they don't dive and do this. They wait till low tide to go down. So they're neither daytime nor nighttime animals. They just move around as they're going along. So if the low tide's at night, they will move in and do their bits and pieces where they need to. Now, the one thing, and we were talking, Matt was bringing up climate change. One of the things that is hampering these birds, and there's less than 6,000 left on the planet now, and they're regarded as critically endangered, is the fact that they are excellent indicator species, where if water quality or areas around the coast are starting to drop, their numbers will drop, because the mollusks then get wiped out and then they can't eat anything. So this is a major part of what we're doing, and human development has a major impact on these things. You think of our coastal cities. We like being on the coast. It's a great place to be, but we're impacting so much more than that. The other thing these guys do is a Mediterranean mussel was introduced to South Africa, and these guys have an affinity for taking these things out because it's not used to these oyster catchers and the strength of them. So it actually clears up space for our African mussels to take hold. So now we're going to move on to our African skimmer, a very different specialized bird.
Now, this bird is, I've had the privilege of seeing them several times in the Okavango Delta, and I was sitting here at home, and I live quite far south of the Okavango Delta, south and east towards the, and I was sitting at home towards the end of 2019, and I looked up and I saw one of these guys flying around. And it's interesting that this could potentially have been the first confirmed sighting of an African skimmer since the 1960s. Now, they rely heavily on sandy beaches in estuaries, or like in the likes of the Okavango Delta and a delta, where they can breed. Now, they used to breed in an area called Lake St. Lucia or Isimangaliso wetland. And since that was dammed up, well, not dammed up, but it's silted up through forestry occurring further upstream, you've got all of the silt that gets washed downstream, and the estuary got clogged up, which backlogged it, and it decimated all of their breeding areas. So they have essentially become locally extinct in this area that used to be one of their biggest breeding sites. Now, this bird, very, very specialized in, for its namesake, as you can imagine, a skimmer. They have, their bills are structured kind of like this. So they've got a very long lower bill and a short upper bill. Got very short, stubby legs, very tiny, small little feet. And that is so that they fly head forward. So they fly in almost this kind of a motion, like a helicopter would be flying if it's going at a decent speed. And that's to allow that bottom bill to pierce the water. And that's how they hunt. So they need very flat water and sandy beaches. Now, as they are flying like that, he's hunting, he's feeling with his lower bill. They're what are called tactile hunters. So as soon as they feel something on that bottom bill, they then snap that top bill shut. And as they've got a little bit of momentum, I mean, they're only going after a small fish that might be, I don't know, 10 or 15 grams, but still that momentum alone is enough to flick that head back there, and then they carry on and they take off. Now, climate change might not necessarily have directly affected them in terms of their temperature tolerance. You can see here is a male and a female sitting on a beach. Now, they will counter their effective heat by the males and the females coming and shading and belly wetting the eggs. So that allows them to regulate the temperature of their eggs and their chicks as well. They also use then that neck flexibility to chase away any potential predators from their nesting sites. So they'll come in and they'll mob and they'll try and get predators away, and they'll actually be able to sort of give them a tap on the back of the head and say, hey, get away from here. They only migrate short distances, so they're partial intra-African migrants. So they will breed in certain areas, particularly in the Okavango Delta, or in the there's a big channel in the Chobe River between Namibia, Botswana, and Zambia that have also got big open beaches for them to breed on. And then some of the floodplains in Mozambique that haven't been taken over by sugarcane. So they are, another thing that's really cool about them, with their bill. Now you can imagine through a lifetime of sitting there continuously putting their bill into the water and going, there's a lot of abrasion, a lot of friction, much like what Rich was describing, I think the last webinar, or the first one about the bee eaters and their bills continually growing. These guys have got that same repetitive growth motion coming through in their lower bill. So that allows them to then be these hunters that will tactilely feel something at the same time they're getting sandpapered or water blasted their lower bill, but that'll keep and continuously grow. Just an absolutely fascinating, but very like a cheetah, essentially, a very, very specialized, very small niche. They need flat, calm water, because you can imagine there's actually a picture, and I put it in there, of that group of them flying shoulder to shoulder. You can imagine that's not exactly ideal fishing grounds for something that's trying to feel something. You've got any sort of chop in the water, it's not going to be an easy place to detect fish. So I think this picture was probably actually taken on the wake of a boat or a mackerel going through the delta, where these birds might have thought, oh, opportunity, because there's a disturbance in the water, and they've come down and try to take advantage of that. But typically, they can't hunt very well in anything but very calm waters. So yeah, just a really fascinating bird that I'm sure you've seen them also a couple of times up in the Okavango, Rich.
I've actually seen them further north, Matt, in Uganda on the Kazinga Channel when we do that channel trip, which is one of my favorite 2 hours of any trip, because I'll burn through about 1,000 photographs in one session. I mean, as you're driving, these guys take off, and then it's just skimming around you, and it's madness. But what you were saying there with the bill really fascinates me, because can you imagine the sense, or the tactile sense within that? I mean, it's a hard bill. Most people wouldn't even think that you'd be able to feel through it. It's like a fingernail. There's very little feeling on a fingernail. But these guys have immense stuff. And the next time any of you are really close to a duck, have a look at its bill. At the end of its bill, you'll see all these tiny little pits in there. And all of these are touch sensory cells that are able to pick up the minutest changes in the water. Any of these filter feeders, even something like the flamingos we were talking about, think about the ability for those animals to filter out and feel what they're eating. It blows my mind.
And do it at such a speed like that as it's coming down, it's not only feeling something, but then it's reacting to it. That's the fascinating thing. It's
absolutely.
Wow.
I mean, the twitch muscles must be going off one after the other like crazy.
Incredible.
So now we're going to move on to a really colorful bird that occurs in South Africa and Southern Africa, and moving up to East Africa, and these are called the turacos. Now, in order to appreciate just how special these animals are, I want to discuss with you guys just how color is rendered within birds and within nature. So generally, it's derived from two ways. First is reflection or refraction of certain wavelengths of light, and this is called iridescence or scattering of light. This form of color is mechanical in nature, with orientation of the feather cells and the outer layers of keratin reflecting the relevant colors and the wavelengths that are exposed to light. When there's no light, these colors will disappear and they effectively look like they're black. Usually they show shorter wavelengths of light, so your blues, your indigos, your violets, and possibly white. There's still some debate around that. The second way is through pigments, or so-called chemical colors. And these are interesting because they're not derived from direct sunlight to make them visible. They can even be seen in shadows and areas like that. So these can be broken down into two different types. So you've got your carotenoids, which are your longer wavelengths, so your reds, your yellows, your oranges, and then your melanins. Now we have melanin in varying amounts, but it's your darker colors, your browns through your blacks. And combined, they create a wide range of colors. Now, where the turaco becomes really spectacular is that these are unique, not only locally, but globally, for having pigments that are not found in any other bird species on the planet. The brilliant red that you can see underneath these wings here is created by a pigment called tyrosine. And the greens and the blues are created by an uncombined turacovadin is the other pigment. And when I talk about uncombined, it is the only pure green pigment to be found in any bird on the planet. All other birds that have green in them are created by iridescence or a combination of yellow pigment with melanin or a blue iridescence. So an amazing color adaptation. And I chucked in our very guy that looks like he was last in line when the color was handed out. This is the gray go-away bird, so called because of its call, where he says, "Quay, quay." And he does this a lot when there's predators around and everything. These guys were all lumped into one group called the, now my brain's gone stupid, Luries. And these Luries were then broken down and changed to Turacos and the go-away bird, specifically because this go-away bird lacks those two pigments. So really fascinating fruit-eating birds. We see a lot of them on all of our trips. This one here is a great blue Turaco. He's probably about 25 inches tall, so it's a massive bird. And they're quite ungainly when they're flying. All of these birds, you'll see them flap crazily and then try glide, and then flap crazily and then try glide. So it's always this back and forth that goes on with them. But beautiful to see, especially when they launch off and this red coloration comes out. I don't know, Matt, I love these guys. What do you think about Turacos?
We've got some of the purple crested Turacos that flutter about in the trees around our house. And just like you said, they're great hopping birds. So they're incredible at hopping along a branch, and then they kind of jump off, and they've got this whack, like that. Is that a Livingston's in the top left, where they go and then shoo, and then they need a bit more, and then they flap, 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 flap,
Yeah.
and then they shoo, and then they flap, 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 kind of like on Angry Birds, if you can imagine that. Just they have the most bizarre flight pattern, but they're great hoppers. They really are great hoppers. And yeah, just their calls are always something that it makes you, it's warming coming into the bush, essentially, for me. That's one of those few calls where you think about it. And it was probably one of the first calls that I heard when I was a child, was that purple crested Turaco, and it's a fond memory for me.
That is an awesome call.
Oh, too cool. Now these guys, the saddle-billed stork, they're not sort of 25 inches tall. These guys stand pretty much almost as tall as I do. You can see the pair on the left there. That's a male and a female. The male being shown off by his little sort of saddle underneath his neck there, and then the female has got the yellow ring around her eye. So she's got the makeup and he's got the bow tie. Now these guys can live up to about 30 years old. And as mentioned, they're huge birds, exclusively carnivorous, so exclusively hunters. And in their breeding biology, both of them share the incubation and the parental responsibilities, as you can see there in that massive sort of balcony-like nest that they've got on top of the tree there. So they'll go off, they'll hunt, they'll bring back, and during the brooding and the nesting period, they'll each take a turn to sit on the eggs. Now, because of that, and because of their high parental care, they've got a fairly low mortality with their youngsters. They'll also come back and they'll moisten the eggs, so thermoregulation there. They'll moisten the eggs with regurgitated water. And once these shells hatch and the youngsters are born, the adults will then re-ingest those eggshells to then help with their calcium intake, because obviously they've released quite a bit of it to produce that egg and to produce that young, and then they will need to get it back into their system. Now, they, much like an eagle and a vulture, they've got these giant feathered, fluted wings that help them with gliding and also help them with being able to connect and catch thermals. So it allows them to then glide up quite high if they need to. They've got a very long shape, which makes them incredible gliders. And then obviously coming down to land, those big wings do help that. And it's a fascinating thing with a lot of storks, and Rich will talk about this in much more detail with the next one, but their thermoregulation with their, obviously they're a big bird, they've got a lot of black, a lot of dark colors on those wings. How do you, without being able to sweat in the African sun, how do you cool such a big body so effectively? Now, that's probably one of the best adaptations from the bird that you're going to talk about next. I'm not going to steal your thunder with that, but I'll hand it over to you to chat a little bit more about marabous.
All right, so saddle-billed storks are amazing and far more pretty than this guy. What I want to highlight is that saddle-bills within South Africa are very endangered. There's about 200 mating pairs left, and there are some research projects going on that actually look at the ribbing on the black part of this bill, which are unique to each bird, to be able to identify them. For a while, the EWT, Endangered Wildlife Trust here in South Africa, who work closely with WWF, actually were doing photographic representations where people entering Kruger National Park and other parks were asked to submit photos so they could build the database of the birds themselves. So like we said, these guys are not all that young, not all that as pretty as their cousins. This is a baby, and one that only a mother could love. And Matt's having a giggle now, and I feel like we have to bring you into this whole thing. But while we were doing our virtual safari, there was a story that popped up about a guy who was driving under the influence of alcohol, and he was pulled over by a police officer, and the officer said, "Sir, are you drunk?" He says, "No." So the guy says, "Okay, well then I would like you to say the alphabet, please, starting with M." The guy smiles and says, "Malphabet." And when we look at this bird, all we can see is that guy saying Malphabet. So it's quite crazy. So these guys are referred to as the Undertakers of the bush. They do look something hideous, and they are part of what we call the Ugly Five. Now, the Ugly Five, Matt, for your reference, is the most amazing book for your kid, which is written by Julia Donaldson. Just saying. But the Ugly Five are the marabou stork, the hyena, the wildebeest, the lappet-faced vulture, and my favorite, the warthog. And these guys, their form matches function. Nothing happens in nature without reason. And as ugly as they are, they do their jobs correctly. They will scavenge off of carcasses and, like vultures, have very few feathers around the head to stop anything getting on there. But they are subordinate to scavenging vultures and scavenging eagles. So they will actually have to wait at a carcass, despite the size that, again, is as big as Danny DeVito at 1.5 meters. They have to wait for a moment to run in and steal things. And they're called kleptoparasites for that reason. They like to steal their food from these other guys. Now, while they primarily scavenge, they will take advantage of different things, like insect eruptions. We were talking in another one of the bird talks about a eruption of termites that I was witness to, and there must have been about 5,000 different birds there. And these guys will go in to pick off those elates, the future king and queen termites, which we often call flying ants, because they're so protein rich. They'll also catch different fish, especially like the catfish. As the water levels drop and these fish are struggling in the mud to try and get under or get away, these guys will take advantage of that. They'll eat crocodile eggs. They'll eat baby crocodiles. And our flamingo friends that I was referring to earlier. As those beautiful breeding grounds of theirs start to dry up, what happens is there's chasms of space in these hot areas on baked salty soil that now need to be covered to get from there to water to be able to drink. And as these little babies move around in creches, the marabou storks come in and pick off the weaker ones. So the pink skin under the neck, this big what looks like a dewlap in front here is actually called a gular air sac. It is not the crop, it is not full of food, and it is not full of anything other than air and lots of blood capillaries. So Matt was talking about this thermoregulation, the ability to keep yourself cool, because again, this is a gigantic bird with a big black back that doesn't stay a lot near water. So it will stay out in the open and it needs to cool down. So one way it does it is by moving air through this giant sac through the front and moving it through, and the blood gets cooled, and that brings the body temperature down and the blood temperature down, going to its tiny little beady brain. It's also used by some males as a way of displaying during the mating season. So the males will show off their size by inflating that gular sac, making it look nice and big and prominent so they can outperform the other males. The other thing they do, which is quite crazy, is look at their legs. And this was what Matt was referring to, which is thermoregulation through defecation on their legs. They actually urinate and defecate on their legs. So bird urine and feces is not separated. It's all mixed together in this white substance. And whether by luck or not, it forms on the legs, which then cools through evapotranspiration, through this evaporation that happens. And then this dry powder then coats the black legs and reflects light off of them. This is called urohydrosis. So some really interesting cooling mechanisms that this big, ugly creature goes through. But his scavenging is not limited to outside. They will scavenge in our dumps. In different places, they will pick off frogs. They will go to sewage farms and move through those. So just their name and their seedy look just doesn't give them the best feeling. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Matt.
Yeah, that seedy, I mean, for some reason, and no offense if any of them are watching, but I doubt it because it was quite a long time ago, but they actually remind me of some of my teachers from boarding school. So it's just the way they walk, it looks like they have their hands behind their neck. Look at me like I'm in trouble. He's got, what have you done, my boy? So what was saying, but yes, so just to touch on what Richard was saying about that gular sac, a lot of birds are doing it. They pant to cool themselves. A lot of birds is a gular flutter, where they just open their bill lightly and they flutter that gular very, very quickly and very short, shallow breaths. But that obviously, what it does is you're doing that through evapotranspiration. So you're cooling down by losing moisture. And like Rich was saying, where you've got these, they don't have a lot of moisture. They often don't live very close to water. So if they were to do that, they would then dehydrate. And so that's where this cooling mechanism inside here, where it's done by blood capillary action rather than actual evapotranspiration, makes it that much more advantageous for them being these massive, dark boarding school teachers.
I love that. The boarding school teacher, you just finished me right there.
It does. He looks just like, I mean, just imagine the way they walk around a carcass. They walk like this. They've got very short steps, their head down. They're walking straight out of a scene going, no, you've done something wrong. But a group of birds that has done very little wrong, and it's where we are going to finish off tonight, is what is often thought of and described as if Darwin was to land on anywhere else on Earth that could have given him more to talk about co-evolution and convergent and divergent evolution, it would have been Madagascar, and it would have been this group of birds that he would have described. They are known as the Wengers, and they are one of the few groups of birds that encompass all the varietals of bill types and feeding activities. They've got, as you can see down at the bottom there, the sickle-billed Wenger, the one that's got that giant long bill, much like the hoopoes we were talking about 2 weeks ago, where they are arboreal and terrestrial gleaners. They'll probe into things and they will glean any insects out of that, all the way around to probably one of my favorites on the sort of the 3 o'clock arm is the Natachanga, which is this tiny. He's about that big, and he hops up and down and scurries up and down the tree trunks looking for little insects as well. But they've got very much like a flycatcher sort of a bill, so a very short, quick action, poking at it, picking it off, and flying away. They are just this fascinating group of birds that have been able to sort of infiltrate and adapt to every niche that is necessary in Madagascar. And I mean, what is your favorite out of these ones, Rich?
I would have to say the blue Wenger, because this coloration that comes off this guy is madness. It is that starling blue, but it just is beautiful. But again, just as you're saying, the varieties of them, from these that go up and start doing the zygodactylus, climbing up of trees vertically like a woodpecker, versus those that are gleaning. I mean, these guys we see in Undertakers, and it's just awesome to hear them. And they're bigger than you think. I mean, these guys are, you know, at least 10 inches tall. And then you get your helmeted Wenger, which is this big guy here, which we don't see on our trips, but I'd love to see, which is much, much bigger. I mean, it's the size of a hornbill. So you get all this variety. It just blows my mind how things have changed in such a great way without our influence.
There was actually a so fingers crossed and hoping that we do get to Madagascar this year, but there was actually and they only nest at it's spring into summer, but there was one of these guys nesting in Ranamafana at the very and that's they've got, it's a big bird the size of a hornbill, but they've got this tiny little nest that's probably, I don't know, the size of a cereal bowl. And so you see this head popping out one side and this tail popping out the other side in what clearly appears to be far too small a nest for this giant bird. And you think, dude, just like buy a bigger house or build a bigger house.
Well, evolution happened to him, but not his nest.
Exactly. But then, yeah, like you were saying with the Natachanga, the zygodactylus, the way they move up and down, they'll not only go up, but they'll also face downwards. I've seen them running down a branch, head down, and that allows them to then chase a lot of these the insects that they're fluttering around in the forests. And almost all of these are forest dwelling, whether it is the wet mountainous and rainforest of eastern Madagascar, going down that escarpment, that coastal escarpment, or into the dry deciduous forest down in the southwest, or up into the north in the mangroves where we find the sickle-billed bangers in Anjajavi. So they've been able to encompass every single one of these niches, and that's why, as I mentioned to start with them, if Darwin had arrived in Madagascar, this would have been it wouldn't have been finches and bill types. It would have been Wengers and niches to hold. And so just an incredible group of birds, more so than a single individual species, to kind of tone in and tie in all of our birds that we've been able to speak about over the last couple of webinars.
Thanks, Kendall. I think we're ready for some questions from audience, please.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys. We've got a lot of good questions for you, and I just want to remind everyone who's watching, if you have a question for Matt or Rich today, you can submit those in your control panel under the questions field. Okay, first of all, Matt, there was a lot of congratulations for you, so I just want to convey everyone's excitement. So congratulations.
Thank you.
And first question, what is the average lifespan of a barn swallow?
Barn swallows, I mean, they can live, I think, up to about 15 years old, 10 or 15 years, isn't that correct? Somewhere around there?
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to give you an exact number. We'll have a look and get back to you on that. But the generally size is function. So the smaller something is, the shorter its lifespan will be. And also traveling those huge distances year in, year out will definitely wear on the aging side of things.
Yeah, so just a very high metabolic rate would result in a shorter lifespan, but I think it's around the maybe 10 or 12-year mark.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of people were wondering a couple things about shoebills. One, can they fly? And two, what are their lifespans?
So they live for about 35 years, and yes, they can fly. They have these massive wings, but they're not elegant flyers by any stretch of the imagination. But yeah, that prehistoric face just gets me every time. Every time.
I was saying to Rich when we were getting ready for this, and when he put that photo up, they always kind of remind me of like a mobster or a debt collector or someone that's just looking at you with that. Oh, yeah.
I agree.
Yeah, I killed my brother or sister.
Exactly.
Okay, you mentioned when you're talking about flamingos, lesser flamingos. Can you explain where that comes from, the term lesser?
It's not a huge difference in size comparison. They're very similar in height and size. It's just a way of differentiating between the two species. At least that's my understanding. Have you got any other? It's like the black and white rhino. One isn't exactly black and the other is white. It's just a way of differentiating the two species.
Yeah, I think again that small change in size is enough to put it into the lesser and greater, but that would be it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, right. And the African black oyster catchers, someone was wondering if they're related to the black oyster catchers found in the Northwest US.
Absolutely, they are. I think in total around the world there are around 7 different species of oyster catcher. So yes, they are. They're just a different form in a different place, and obviously through space have changed over time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and there were a lot of people wondering, the saddlebill stork, they seem to have a little spot on their chest. Can you explain what that is?
So that's the crop. So a bird's digestive system is slightly different to ours. They have a storage chamber or a stomach called a crop. And as that gets filled, they actually have a space there so that they can expand out and become bigger while they digest that food and move it through. And so that little spot on the chest there is called the crop.
Yeah, in vultures, it sits below here, and it's one of the ways where you can tell if a vulture is going to or leaving an area of a carcass is by looking for this big bulge in the front of their throats. And different birds have it in different positions. Obviously, for a bird like this that needs a lot of neck mobility and agility, it can't have a crop halfway up its neck. So it's usually around, probably closer to its center of gravity. And so that, like Rich was saying, it allows it to expand and to contract.
Okay, now staying on the saddlebill stork, there are a couple questions about the wings. Someone wants to know how big the wingspan is, and when you said fluted wing, what does that exactly mean?
Not so much fluted, but sort of your fingertips. So that's what you would look at a vulture, and you can see those very distinct fingertipped wings. And the wingspan of a saddlebill stork can reach up to about 6 feet, 6.5 feet, which is, I mean, it's what my wingspan is essentially if I was to have wings.
And what's even crazier, if we talk wingspan, when these guys get moving, the Marabous storks, they can have a wingspan of up to 12 feet. So massive, massive birds. So it just puts in perspective how big these guys are.
That's incredible. And the last question about the saddlebill storks, someone wants to know how many eggs do they lay and how often do they have young?
It's typically 2, sometimes 3, but only 2 will be reared, and it's not biannually, but it's every 2nd year, I believe. So they'll have an offspring, and it takes a year to raise them, and then they'll have the next offspring the year later. So they'll essentially skip a year in between clutches.
In the Wengers, someone mentioned they're so diverse. How is it possible that they're in the same family?
So I think this is why evolution is so beautiful, because in Madagascar, because it was so kept separate from the rest of the world. Remember, it's had 80 million years to be on its own. Where you think of the Galapagos, where Darwin found his amazing finches, those have been around for maybe 3 million years. I speak under correction there, but it's a much shorter lifespan. So over that time, as birds arrived through storms or whatever, they would have landed in a spot and then moved further away. And because they moved far enough away, they would have found a different niche and started to change. So over 80 million years and the spreading out, slowly but surely, that evolution would just click over to completely diversify into different forms of food, into different build types, into different sizes, shapes, and niches, because they don't have the competition like Africa, where we've got 900 odd species of birds in Southern Africa. They have about 80 that are resident, 80 to 100 that are resident there, and then a few migrants that come in. So the competition is far less, and they needed to fill different niches in order to fill those gaps. Matt, any fill in from your side?
No, that describes it perfectly. That lack of that. Also, you're evolving with everything else that's evolving, and in a closed environment, in a closed ecosystem that an island is, you would expect birds who can move and are mobile and go elsewhere. But these, because they are so specific in their niches, they didn't need to go and move elsewhere. You've got African birds that occur there. And they're no different, or very, very slightly different to those that occur on the mainland. But they didn't need to evolve, or they would have evolved in Africa and moved and had a bit of co-evolution. These guys are only found in Madagascar. There are other Wengers in India and in your Indian Oceans or Indian Ocean islands. So they are part of those families, but this group of birds, the Wengers, is specifically endemic to Madagascar, and that's because of that isolated and cut off evolution.
Okay, great. Well, gentlemen, it's the top of the hour, so I'm going to call it there with questions. Thank you so much. Another wonderful presentation from you. I'm going to hand it back over to you for closing comments, and we'll start with Richard.
Thanks, guys, and thanks for tuning in. Thank you, Kendall. Thank you, NatHab. Thank you, WWF. We absolutely love being with you guys and spending the time. I hope you guys enjoyed the behind the scenes of the chaos behind the beauty. And I wasn't talking about me, I'm talking about the background. And Matt, I hope you get some sleep, bud.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks, Kendall. NatHab, WWF, as always, an incredible pleasure it is to stand here in front of everyone. And thanks everyone for tuning in. And thank you for the internet for working tonight. It's always great when technology is on your side. Maybe it helps that I'm in a baby's room and not in the middle of the bush at Sabi Sabi. But yes, thanks for the congrats, and thanks everyone. She is an incredible gift and something that I will hope to show you maybe on one of the future webinars. But thank you everyone for tuning in, and have a great rest of the day and week.
Thanks. We're so happy for you, Matt. So congratulations again. And I'd like to thank everyone who tuned in today. Unfortunately, we had to cancel tomorrow's webinar, so be sure to join us Wednesday for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, and we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, guys.
Cheerio.